Her hand still smelled of dish soap when she said it. Colleen stood on the porch of Wade Hollister's farmhouse, her eyes fixed on the weathered wooden boards beneath her feet, refusing to meet his gaze. The evening air carried the scent of hay and something unspoken. "I am not fit for any man," she said, her voice steady but hollow. Wade didn't move, didn't blink. 3 years of raising 2 kids alone had taught him to recognize when someone was offering everything they had left. "But I can love your children." The words hung between them like smoke. She waited for him to tell her to leave, to say what every other man had said before. But Wade Hollister went quiet, not from disappointment, but from something far more dangerous. He was beginning to understand what he truly needed, and it terrified him. The morning sun crept through the kitchen window of the Hollister farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Wade stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this exact task over 1,000 times. The smell of coffee mingled with the sweet scent of batter, and somewhere outside, a rooster announced the day with irritating punctuality. Beau sat at the table, his 10-year-old frame hunched over a glass of orange juice, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Rosie, 6 years old and incapable of sitting still for more than 30 seconds, bounced in her chair while narrating a dream she had about a purple horse that could fly. Wade listened with half an ear, nodding at the appropriate moments, his mind already calculating the day's tasks. Feed the chickens, fix the fence by the south pasture, pick up groceries, help Beau with his science project. The list never ended. It simply recycled itself, day after day, like the seasons that rolled across these 50 acres of Tennessee farmland. Wade Hollister was 42 years old, though most days he felt closer to 60. His hands were calloused from years of work, his back ached from lifting things he probably shouldn't lift alone, and his heart carried a weight that no amount of physical labor could shift. 3 years ago, his wife had decided that farm life wasn't for her anymore, that he wasn't for her anymore. She had packed 2 suitcases and driven away in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, leaving behind a confused son, a crying daughter, and a man who didn't know how to explain to his children why their mother had chosen somewhere else over them. He never spoke ill of her, not once. When Rosie asked where Mommy went, he simply said she had to go find something important, and maybe someday she would come back. He didn't believe it himself, but children needed hope more than they needed truth. The farmhouse was clean, but tired, much like its owner. The floors were swept, the dishes were done, but there was a certain emptiness that no amount of tidying could fill. The dining table had 4 chairs, but only 3 were ever used. The 4th sat against the wall, pushed back slightly, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Wade had thought about getting rid of it 100 times, but something always stopped him. Maybe it was the way Rosie sometimes glanced at it, her small face clouded with questions she didn't know how to ask. Or maybe it was his own stubborn inability to admit that some things were truly over. Either way, the chair remained, a silent monument to a family that used to be whole. It was Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm who first mentioned Colleen. She had stopped by one afternoon with a basket of tomatoes and a piece of advice wrapped in Southern politeness. "Wade, honey, you look like you haven't slept in a month," she had said, her eyes taking in the laundry pile visible through the doorway, the dishes stacked in the sink, the general chaos of a household run by a man stretched too thin. "I know a woman who does housework. Good woman. Quiet. Keeps to herself mostly. But she's reliable as rain. Name's Colleen. Lives in that little place off Route 7. You should give her a call." Wade had taken the number more out of politeness than genuine interest. He didn't need help. He had managed fine on his own for 3 years. But that night, as he stood in the kitchen at midnight trying to get a stain out of Rosie's favorite dress while simultaneously reviewing Beau's homework, He found himself staring at the scrap of paper with Colleen's number on it. The next morning, he made the call. Colleen arrived on a Thursday, driving an old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better decades. She was somewhere in her late 30s, with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a faded blue shirt, work boots that had actually seen work. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that would make her stand out in a crowd, and yet Wade found himself unable to look away. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was something else, something he couldn't quite name. She carried herself like a person who expected nothing from the world and was rarely surprised when she received exactly that. When she shook his hand, her grip was firm but brief, as if prolonged contact was something she preferred to avoid. "I can come twice a week," she said, her voice low and even. "Tuesday and Friday. I'll clean, do laundry, cook if you need it. I charge fair rates, and I don't steal." Wade almost laughed at the bluntness of it, but something in her expression stopped him. She wasn't joking. She was simply stating facts, the way one might describe the weather. He hired her on the spot. The first few weeks, Colleen moved through the house like a ghost. She arrived precisely at 8 in the morning, worked with silent efficiency, and left by 2 in the afternoon without a single unnecessary word. Wade found himself oddly comforted by her presence, even though they barely spoke. The house began to feel different. Cleaner, yes, but also somehow warmer, as if her hands left behind traces of care that lingered in the folded towels and scrubbed floors. Beau ignored her mostly, as 10-year-old boys tend to do with adults, who aren't immediately relevant to their interests. But Rosie was fascinated from the start. She would follow Colleen from room to room, chattering endlessly about school, about her friends, about the cat she wanted but wasn't allowed to have. Colleen listened with patience, responding in brief sentences that somehow encouraged more conversation rather than less. When Rosie asked her name, Colleen had smiled, a small, careful smile that barely reached her eyes, and said, "Just Colleen, that's all." Rosie had nodded solemnly, as if this were the most profound answer she had ever received. Wade noticed things, small things. The way Colleen always set the table for 4, even though she knew only 3 would eat. The way she sometimes paused in front of the photographs on the wall, studying the images of a family that no longer existed in its original form. The way her hands lingered on Rosie's drawings, which were taped to the refrigerator in a chaotic collage of crayon colors. Most of all, he noticed the way she looked at his children, with a tenderness that seemed to surprise even her, as if she hadn't expected to feel anything, and was unsettled by the discovery that she did. He didn't ask about her life outside this farmhouse. He sensed that she preferred it that way, and he was not a man who pushed where he wasn't invited. But sometimes, late at night, he found himself wondering about the sadness that lived behind her careful eyes. The fence post had been loose for weeks, but Wade kept putting off the repair because there was always something more urgent demanding his attention. That particular Tuesday, however, the urgency arrived in the form of 2 escaped goats and a very angry neighbor. Wade spent the morning chasing the animals back where they belonged, and by the time he got around to fixing the fence, his patience was worn thin and his attention was scattered. The hammer came down wrong, catching the edge of his palm instead of the nail. The gash was deep enough to require stitches, and the blood was enough to make him lightheaded. He stumbled into the kitchen to find Colleen washing dishes, and for a moment, he just stood there, hand wrapped in his shirt, trying to figure out what to do. She turned, saw the blood, and something shifted in her expression. Not panic, she didn't seem like the type to panic, but a sudden alertness, a sharpening of focus. "Sit down," she said, and her voice left no room for argument. She cleaned the wound with steady hands, while Wade tried not to wince. Her touch was gentle despite its efficiency, and he found himself studying her face as she worked. The faint lines around her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together in concentration, the single strand of hair that had escaped her ponytail and fallen across her cheek. "You need stitches," she said without looking up. "Hospital. Now." Wade started to protest. He had too much to do. The kids would be home from school in a few hours. Who would take care of everything? But she cut him off with a look that brooked no disagreement. "I'll stay with the children. Go." It was the first time she had ever offered to do anything beyond her prescribed duties, and the surprise of it rendered him momentarily speechless. He drove himself to the hospital with his good hand, leaving behind a farmhouse that suddenly felt less empty than it had in years. When he returned that evening, his hand wrapped in bandages and his system swimming with painkillers, he found a house transformed by her presence. The kitchen was clean, the laundry was folded, and the children were fed, bathed, and tucked into their beds. A plate of food sat on the table, covered with a dish towel to keep it warm. Colleen was already gone, her truck no longer in the driveway, no note left behind. But evidence of her care filled every corner of the rooms. Wade sat alone at the table, eating the simple meal she had prepared, and felt something crack open in his chest. It wasn't hunger that she had satisfied. It was something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since his wife drove away on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He was lonely. He had been lonely for 3 years, and he had hidden it so well that he had almost convinced himself it wasn't true. But sitting here now, in a kitchen warmed by someone else's labor, he could no longer pretend. Rosie mentioned it first, as children often do with the observations adults are too careful to voice. "Colleen's food tastes like how moms cook on TV," she said one evening, her mouth full of mashed potatoes. "It's nice and warm, and it doesn't taste like Dad's." Wade should have felt offended, but he only felt a strange tightening in his throat. Beau glanced up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "She's just the cleaning lady," he said, but there was something uncertain in his voice, as if he were testing a theory he didn't quite believe. Rosie shook her head firmly. "She's not just cleaning. She's taking care of us. That's different." Wade looked at his daughter, at the simple certainty in her young face, and wondered when his 6-year-old had become wiser than him. The weeks that followed were marked by subtle shifts, like the slow turning of seasons that you don't notice until suddenly the leaves have changed. Colleen began staying longer, not because Wade asked, but because there always seemed to be one more task that needed doing. She helped Beau with his math homework, her patience infinite in the face of his frustration. She braided Rosie's hair in styles that Wade could never have managed, and taught her how to make friendship bracelets, with a seriousness that suggested this was important business indeed. She never overstepped, never presumed too much, but her presence wove itself into the fabric of their days until Wade couldn't quite remember what the house had felt like without her. He found himself inventing reasons to be nearby when she was working, fixing things that didn't need fixing, asking questions about supplies that didn't need replenishing. Sometimes their conversations lasted only a few minutes. Sometimes they stretched into an hour, 2, the afternoon light shifting around them as they talked about nothing and everything. She told him about growing up poor in a small town, about learning to cook from a grandmother who believed food was love made visible. She told him about books she had read, places she hoped to see someday, small dreams that she spoke of quietly, as if afraid that saying them too loud would scare them away. What she didn't tell him, he noticed. She never mentioned family of her own, never spoke of a husband, past or present, never explained the sadness that sometimes flickered across her face when she watched his children play. The fall festival at Rosie's school was advertised on a bright orange flyer that she brought home in her backpack, practically vibrating with excitement. There would be games, she explained, and a haunted house, and something called a cakewalk that she didn't understand, but was certain would be amazing. Wade agreed to take them, as he always did, already preparing himself for an evening of forced small talk with other parents, who looked at him with pity they tried to disguise as friendliness. But this year, something made him pause. "Colleen," he said, catching her as she was gathering her things to leave. "The kids would love it if you came to the festival with us on Saturday." She stopped. Her back was to him, and he watched her shoulders tense, saw the way her hands tightened on her bag. When she turned, her expression was carefully blank. "That's kind of you, Wade, but I don't think that's appropriate." He frowned. "Why not?" "The kids adore you. Rosie's been talking about showing you the craft booth for weeks." Colleen shook her head slowly. "I'm just the help. People will talk. They'll make assumptions. Since when do you care what people say?" The question came out sharper than he intended, and he saw her flinch. She didn't answer. She simply gathered her things and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. "Some of us have to care," she said quietly. "Some of us don't have the luxury of not caring." The conversation with Mrs. Patterson happened by accident. Wade had stopped by her farm to return a tool he'd borrowed, and she had insisted on coffee and pie, as she always did, and he had accepted, as he always did. They talked about the weather, about the new family that had moved into the old Henderson place, about nothing in particular. And then, almost casually, Mrs. Patterson said, "How's Colleen working out for you? She seems like a sweet woman. Had a rough time of it from what I hear." Wade set down his coffee cup. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Patterson looked at him with the knowing eyes of a woman who had lived long enough to see most kinds of sorrow. "She was married, you know. Years ago. Nice fellow, or so everyone thought. But when they found out she couldn't have children." She shook her head, her lips pressing together in disapproval. "He left her. Just up and left. And his family, they were cruel about it. Said she was defective. Not a real woman." She paused, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigor. "She's been on her own ever since. Works hard, keeps to herself. But I imagine that kind of thing leaves a mark on a person." Wade drove home slowly, Mrs. Patterson's words echoing in his mind. He thought about all the things Colleen had never said, all the silences that suddenly made terrible sense. He thought about the way she watched his children with such longing, the way she always set the table for four, the way she had flinched when Rosie called her cooking motherly. She believed herself broken. She believed she had nothing to offer, and she had spent years having that belief confirmed by people who should have loved her. When he pulled into the driveway, he sat in the truck for a long time, watching the lights in his farmhouse windows, thinking about a woman who had been told she wasn't enough and had come to believe it. He thought about himself, too, about his own loneliness, his own stubborn refusal to acknowledge what he needed. They were the same, he realized, both of them hiding from the same fear. Both of them convinced they had to carry their burdens alone. The Mother's Day incident happened on a Thursday. Rosie had come home from school with a handmade card, glitter still clinging to her fingers, face bright with the particular pride of a child who has created something magnificent. Wade watched from the doorway of the kitchen as she approached Colleen, who was folding laundry at the table. "This is for you," Rosie said, holding out the card. It was covered in hearts and flowers and what appeared to be a purple horse. The flying one, Wade suspected, from her recurring dreams. Colleen took the card slowly, as if it were made of something fragile. Her face went very still. "Rosie, honey, this is beautiful, but you should save this for someone special." Rosie tilted her head, confused. "But you are special." The words hung in the air like something breakable. Wade saw Colleen's eyes fill with tears she was desperately trying to contain. She set the card down on the table with trembling hands. I need to go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell your father I'll finish the laundry tomorrow. She was gone before Wade could reach the kitchen, her truck disappearing down the driveway in a cloud of dust. The card sat on the table where she had left it, glitter catching the afternoon light. Rosie looked up at her father, her small face crumpled with confusion. Did I do something wrong? Wade found Colleen's house just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the heaviness he carried. It was a small place, set back from the road, with a garden that showed signs of careful tending and a porch swing that moved gently in the evening breeze. He knocked on the door and waited, his heart beating in ways that reminded him he was still capable of feeling things he had tried to bury. When she opened the door, her eyes were red, and she didn't seem surprised to see him. Wade, she said, you shouldn't be here. Probably not. He didn't move to leave. Rosie wanted me to tell you that the card is still on the table. She's waiting for you to take it. Colleen shook her head. I can't accept that. You know I can't. Why not? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her eyes he saw years of accumulated pain, disappointment, piled upon disappointment, until the weight of it had become unbearable. Because accepting that card means accepting something I have no right to. Those children aren't mine. This family isn't mine. If you say you're just the help, I swear to God, Colleen. She laughed, but it was a broken sound, nothing like the genuine article. What else am I supposed to say? That's the truth. That's all I can ever be. Wade stepped closer, close enough to see the faint freckles across her nose, close enough to smell the soap she used and the underlying scent of laundry detergent that seemed to follow her everywhere. What if I told you I wanted you to be more than that? The words seemed to stop her breath. She took a step back, her hand going to her chest as if to protect herself from a blow. Don't. Please don't say things like that. Why not? Why can't I say what I feel? Because it's not fair. Her voice cracked. Because I can't give you what you need. I can't give any man what he needs. She stopped, pressed her hand harder against her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. I'm not fit for any man. I can't have children. I can't give you a family. I can't. I already have a family, Wade said. 2 kids who need a mother's love. Not a woman who can give me more babies. A mother. Someone who will braid Rosie's hair and help Beau with his homework and be there when they wake up scared in the middle of the night. Someone who will look at that chair pushed against the wall and see it not as a symbol of who left, but as a place waiting for someone to arrive. The silence between them was vast, filled with everything they had never said. Colleen's tears fell freely now, tracking down her cheeks in silent rivers. But I can love your children. The words came out in a whisper, almost a prayer. That's all I have to offer. Wade reached for her hands, took them in his own, felt them trembling. You think that's not enough? You think I need anything more than that? She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, and in her eyes he saw the first fragile flicker of something that might have been hope. I don't understand. You don't have to understand. You just have to believe me when I say that what you're offering, love for my children, is exactly what this family needs. Exactly what I need. She shook her head slowly. I'm broken, Wade. He squeezed her hands tighter. You're not broken. You're the only one here who doesn't see how whole you are. She cried then. Really cried. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep that words can't reach it. Wade held her on that small porch as the sun finished setting, and the stars began to emerge, one by one, across the Tennessee sky. He didn't try to comfort her with words because there were no words adequate to the moment. He simply held her and let his presence say what his voice could not. That she was wanted, that she was valued, that the emptiness she had carried for so long did not have to be hers forever. When her tears finally slowed, she pulled back just enough to look at him, her face streaked and swollen, and more beautiful to him than anything he had ever seen. "What happens now?" she asked. He thought about Rosie's card on the table, about Beau's tentative acceptance, about the chair pushed against the wall that had waited so long for someone to claim it. "Now," he said. "You come home." The morning after felt both strange and inevitable, like waking up in a room you've always known but never quite seen clearly. Colleen arrived at the farmhouse early, before the children were awake, and she and Wade shared coffee on the porch in the gray light of dawn. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them had shifted, transformed from something heavy into something comfortable, like an old blanket worn soft by years of use. When Rosie stumbled into the kitchen, still half asleep and rubbing her eyes, she stopped short at the sight of Colleen sitting at the table. Then her face split into a grin wide enough to break hearts. "You came back," she said, launching herself at Colleen with the full force of 6-year-old enthusiasm. Colleen caught her, held her close, and over the child's head, her eyes met Wade's. They were wet, but the tears weren't sad anymore. "I did," she said. "I came back." Beau appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral in the way of boys who have learned not to hope too much. But when Colleen smiled at him and asked if he wanted pancakes, something in his posture softened. He nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and took his seat at the table. Wade watched his family, his whole family now, or the beginning of one, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 long years. The days that followed were ordinary, and that was exactly what made them precious. Colleen still cleaned, still did laundry, still cooked meals that Rosie proclaimed tasted like TV moms should taste. But now she stayed for dinner. Now she helped with homework without being asked. Now she sat in the 4th chair at the table, and if anyone noticed the significance, no one mentioned it aloud. The change was gradual enough to feel natural, inevitable even, like a river finding its way to the sea. Wade caught himself smiling at odd moments, while feeding the chickens, while driving to pick up supplies, while lying in bed at night thinking about nothing in particular. He had forgotten what it felt like to smile without trying. Mrs. Patterson noticed, of course. She stopped by one afternoon with another basket of tomatoes and a look in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "You seem lighter these days," she observed, handing him the basket. "Good to see it." Wade just nodded, but he felt his face warm. Some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The Mother's Day card eventually found its way to Colleen's hands, though not in the way anyone expected. It was Rosie who brought it up, almost a week after the incident, approaching Colleen with the careful seriousness that children reserve for their most important questions. "Do you not like the card because it wasn't good enough?" she asked, her voice small. Colleen knelt down to Rosie's level, taking the girl's hands in her own. "The card was beautiful, sweetheart. The most beautiful card I've ever seen." "Then why did you give it back?" Colleen was quiet for a moment, searching for words that a 6-year-old could understand. "Because I was afraid," she finally said. "I was afraid that I didn't deserve something so special." Rosie considered this with the gravity it warranted. "But everyone deserves special things," she said. "That's why we make cards, so people know they're special." Wade watched from the doorway as Colleen pulled his daughter into a hug, watched her shoulders shake with the effort of containing emotions too large for any one person to carry. When Rosie pulled back, she pressed the card into Colleen's hands. "There," she said, satisfied. "Now you know." And somehow, impossibly, it was that simple. The autumn came to Tennessee with its usual fanfare. leaves turning amber and crimson, the air carrying the crisp promise of colder days ahead. The fall festival at Rosie's school arrived on a Saturday that dawned clear and golden, perfect weather for outdoor celebrations. Wade stood in the kitchen, adjusting his collar and feeling more nervous than the occasion warranted. This year would be different. This year, he wouldn't walk through those crowds alone, pretending not to notice the pitying glances of other families. This year, Colleen would be beside him. She came down the stairs in a simple dress the color of autumn leaves, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen before. She looked uncertain, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Is this okay? I wasn't sure what people wear to these things. He crossed the room and took her hands, stilling their nervous movement. You look perfect. And he meant it. Not just about the dress. The festival was everything Rosie had promised, and more. Games with prizes nobody needed, food that would cause regrets later, and a haunted house that Beau pronounced not scary at all, while refusing to go through a second time. Colleen moved through it all with a wonder that suggested she hadn't experienced many occasions like this in her life. She tried the cakewalk and won a lopsided chocolate cake that Rosie declared the best prize ever. She let Rosie drag her to the craft booth, where they spent an unreasonable amount of time examining homemade jewelry and hand-knitted scarves. She stood beside Wade during the costume parade, her shoulder brushing against his arm, and when Rosie marched by in her princess outfit, she cheered with an enthusiasm that made neighboring parents smile. It felt, Wade thought, like belonging, like finally being where he was supposed to be. The question came from a woman Wade vaguely recognized, another parent, her name lost somewhere in the haze of school events he had attended alone for 3 years. She was looking at their little group with friendly curiosity, her gaze moving from Wade to Colleen to the children and back again. "That your wife?" she asked, nodding toward Colleen. It was a simple question, the kind people asked at events like this without expecting complicated answers. But before Wade could formulate a response, Rosie's voice piped up with the confident certainty of childhood. "She's Colleen," Rosie said. "She takes care of us." The woman smiled, apparently satisfied with this answer, and moved on to her next conversation. But Wade stood frozen, the words echoing in his mind. She takes care of us. Such a simple statement, and yet it contained everything that mattered. He looked at Colleen, saw the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that she had overstepped, that this public acknowledgement was somehow too much. He smiled at her, a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere deep, and said the only thing that needed to be said. "Yeah, she does." The drive home that night was quiet in the best possible way. Rosie had fallen asleep within minutes, her head resting against Colleen's shoulder in the back seat, her princess crown askew and her face smeared with cotton candy. Beau sat beside them, his eyes closed but not quite sleeping, his hand resting near Rosie's, as if to reassure himself she was still there. Wade glanced in the rearview mirror and felt something catch in his throat. For 3 years, that back seat had seemed too empty, too quiet, a constant reminder of what was missing. Now it was full. Now it was alive with the presence of people who belonged there. His eyes met Colleen's in the mirror, and she smiled. Not the careful, guarded smile he had grown accustomed to, but something open, something real, something that held no shadows of old pain. He reached back without thinking, and her hand found his, their fingers interlacing across the gap between front and back seats. They drove the rest of the way home like that, connected, complete. When they pulled into the driveway, the farmhouse looked different somehow, though nothing had physically changed. The same worn boards, the same peeling paint that Wade kept meaning to fix, the same rooster weather vane spinning lazily on the roof. But it didn't look tired anymore. It looked like a home, a real home, one that would be filled with laughter and arguments and all the beautiful messiness of a family learning to become itself. Wade carried Rosie inside, her small body warm and heavy with sleep, while Colleen guided a stumbling Beau toward his room. They tucked the children in together, moving around each other with the ease of people who had done this 1,000 times, though in truth, it was only the first. And when the children were settled, they stood in the hallway between their rooms, the night quiet around them, and looked at each other in the dim light. Wade thought about the words Colleen had spoken on that porch weeks ago. "I am not fit for any man." He thought about how wrong she had been, how utterly and completely mistaken. She wasn't fit for any man. She was fit for this man, for this family, for this life on 50 acres of Tennessee farmland, where the roosters crowed too early and the fences always needed mending, and love showed itself not in grand gestures, but in braided hair and homework help and cards made of glitter and hope. He took her hand and led her to the window at the end of the hall, where moonlight spilled across the fields like silver water. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate for everything they contained. "For what?" She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw not the broken woman who had arrived on his doorstep months ago, but someone whole, someone healed, someone finally allowing herself to be seen. "For loving my children, for loving this life, for—" He stopped, struggled to find the words that would capture what he meant. "For being fit, for being exactly what we needed." She laughed then, and the sound was pure and unguarded, nothing like the broken laugh from the night on her porch. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "I'm still not sure I deserve any of this." "Neither am I," he said. "But I figure we can be scared together. We can figure out what we deserve together." He paused, looked out at the moonlit fields, at the life he had built, and nearly lost, and somehow found again. "I'm not asking for perfect, Colleen. I'm just asking for present. For here. For now. For tomorrow and the day after, and all the days we're lucky enough to get." She squeezed his hand, and when she spoke, her voice was steady in a way it hadn't been before. "I can do that," she said. "I can be here." And outside the window, the farm stretched out beneath the stars, patient and eternal, waiting for the family that was finally, at long last, complete. The morning came the way mornings do, slowly at first, then all at once, light flooding through windows and roosters announcing themselves with their usual lack of consideration for anyone who might want to sleep in. Wade woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Rosie's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. He lay there for a moment, listening, letting the ordinary sounds of a household wash over him like music. When he came downstairs, he found Colleen at the stove, flipping pancakes with the same mechanical precision he had once used himself. Rosie was setting the table. 4 places, 4 chairs, nobody pushed against the wall, while Beau poured orange juice with the careful concentration of a boy determined not to spill. Nobody looked up when Wade entered. Nobody needed to. His presence was expected, assumed, woven into the fabric of the moment, as naturally as breath. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching his family. His whole family. Colleen caught his eye across the kitchen, and something passed between them that didn't require words. 3 years ago, he had stood in this exact spot, making pancakes alone, carrying a weight he thought would never lift. 3 years ago, she had been living in that small house off Route 7, believing herself broken beyond repair, unworthy of the love she so desperately wanted to give. Now here they stood, in a farmhouse that had seen its share of sorrow, surrounded by children who needed them and a life that demanded everything they had. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined. It was better. It was real. It was perfectly, beautifully imperfect. And as Wade took his seat at the table, his full table, his complete family, he thought about Colleen's words on that porch, the words that had started everything. I am not fit for any man, but I can love your children. She had been wrong about the first part, but she had been absolutely right about the second. She could love his children. She did love his children. And in doing so, she had given them all something none of them had dared to hope for anymore. She had given them a home,